Hi, welcome to the training webinar for this week. I'm Dale Franks. Honestly, surprised anyone is here, considering that tomorrow is the 4th of July and the temptation to extend a three-day weekend I thought might be strong for some people, but here we are ready to talk this week about permissions. So let's go ahead and get into permissions, and to the extent that I can in the time that we have available to us today, we'll also talk about permissions methodology as well. Permissions is the system in process director that allows individual users or classes of user to access elements inside the content list, forms, process timelines, or what have you. There are a number of permissions that give people access to different objects. Now, Process Director uses what we call permissive access, which is to say that to access an object in the system, you have to be granted access. If you are not granted access, you simply can't access the object. This permissive access system is great for nearly all instances of permissions use cases that you can come up with. However, there are some special circumstances. So Process Director also has a system called deny permissions. We're not going to talk about them much, except to say that there are cases where rather than just saying, look, we're just going to give all of these people access to this object, sometimes there are times when you have to go into an object, again, very rare, where you say this person simply cannot be allowed to look at this object. And so you have deny permissions. For example, let's say you're at a law firm and one of your attorneys is a personal friend of a new client. And so in that case, you might want to take any of the instances, like a form instance and any of its child objects, or perhaps a process and all of its child objects, and you might want to apply deny permissions for that attorney who would have to recuse himself from any actions that involve your new client, his personal friend or family member or whatever it may be. So that's a case where you might want to implement a deny permission for that specific attorney on a specific set of objects in the system so that he, while otherwise able to access anything else in the system or even in a folder or even other instances of that form or process timeline, he is barred from touching that particular object. And so you can enforce deny permissions on a system if it becomes necessary. Deny permissions are disabled by default in Process Director. There's only one way to enable them, and that is with the f-enable deny permissions custom variable that has to be configured in the vars file. You have to set deny permissions to true. Generally, for a normal system, you will never need to do this. And if you can possibly avoid it, you want to avoid it because deny permissions are expensive. Every time when you turn on deny permissions, then every time someone accesses an object, Process Director has to take that object and then go through the deny permissions list to ensure that the person trying to access that object can actually access it. So it is a much more resource-intensive way of applying permissions. And as I said, in most cases, you don't need to worry about it. It's available for you if you need it, but we generally recommend against its use for almost all use cases. There are a small number of use cases, especially in highly regulated environments or industries, where recusals and debarments and things like that are an important consideration. And in those cases, some level of deny permissions may be needed. In most cases, for most organizations, it's simply not necessary. And so, therefore, we don't have to worry about it, which is why it is disabled by default. So you just need to know that it's available should you need it, although in most cases you should never need it. On a system, whenever you first install Process Director, and excuse me, I have a slight lighting problem. I'm very sorry about this, but I need to fix it or I will not be able to ignore it for the next hour and a half or what have you. So anyway, as I was saying, on a Process Director system, whenever you first install it, permissions are going to be pretty loose. In fact, if we go check the permissions here on this particular folder, this is generally what the permission setup is by default in Process Director, which is to say all authenticated users can have access to everything in the system. We don't know whenever you're installing Process Director, although I guess if you're a cloud customer, we kind of know whenever we're setting it up. But just installing Process Director, the installation doesn't know whether you're a production system or a dev system or what have you. And so permissions are always set fully open. So one of the first things that you need to do are change those permissions to lock down your system. It's not so important on a dev or staging system. It's super important on a production system that permissions are set properly, and permissions should be set very, very early in your system, as soon as you access to it, and they need to be set appropriately. Set them appropriately, we need to know how to set permissions. So we'll get there. But just so that you know, this setup where all authenticated users have access to everything and can edit everything and can delete everything in the system is generally an extraordinarily bad idea. Now, permissions are not the only level of security in Process Director, because there's also the workspace. And our concern with permissions is largely limited to who can access the content list. That's really the main thrust of permissions. And on a normal system, everybody theoretically can access the content list. However, in the real world, that's not exactly true because everybody has their own user profile. So, for example, I'm currently in the admin profile, which shows me my content list and gives me access to the IT admin area and everything else. But most users will probably end up with a UI, kind of like this, where in the workspace itself, it doesn't really give them access to the content list itself. And in the user's the profile page, there is you can give them access to the content list or turn it off, and it's off for everybody by default. So they can't even really look in the content list. So in most cases, for an end user who are going to see a user interface like this, what they can touch are the things that you allow them to touch in this interface. So for example, I have the ability to, to open my task list or to open the IT HR requests. I don't think there are any, but I can open those up, or I can open my task list. I apparently have a task in the system. I don't know what object list is. I assume this is some list of objects that I can open and run. So yeah, this is just a list of a whole bunch of forms or other objects that I'm allowed to run. There's a sample form that I can pop open here. I don't even know what the sample form is, and we don't really need to look at it, but I have, well, here's another dashboard, the Q&A dashboard. So this is what I have access to in the system. So from a UI point of view, I don't really have access to the content list and I can't change anything. And so that's great. But if I ever actually do get access to the content list and my permissions are set as they are in default with everything open, we're going to end up having a problem, because once I can get here through the content list, I can now begin going in and changing things and removing things and editing things. And you don't want people even inadvertently to getting access to the content list and being able to see stuff. So even though I can turn off the content list in the UI, and in fact, it's off by default for most users, and even though my workspaces that I have access to as an end user may not actually give me access to the content list, even indirectly, we got to be careful about giving people content list access. And if they do get content list access, we need to have a proper permissions structure running on the system that will enable them to only see the things and only do the things that we want them to do in the system. So that's why permissions are so important. So let's look in this folder and let's take a look at the permissions just for this folder. And let's just take a look at what our permissions options are. Then we'll talk about permissions methodology and the kind of settings that we can use. Every object in the system has a permissions tab: form, process, timeline, in this case, a folder, whatever. You can set permissions on any object. It's best not to try to manage permissions at the object level. It is best to manage permissions at the folder level, because all permissions are inherited. So, for example, this is what the permissions are in this folder. It's all authenticated users have all permissions. Okay, and that's fine as far as that goes. But if I have this permission set up like this, and let's go ahead and get out of the folder, or at least go back to our content list. So if I go back into the permissions folder, which we were just looking at as to what its permissions were, and I create a new folder, which we'll call webinar, and I hit OK, this new folder is now going to inherit the permissions of my permissions folder, which, as we've seen, is set pretty much wide open. So if I go into this folder and I look at its permissions, it will have the very same permissions as its parent folder. Now, in this case, I happen to create a subfolder. This is true if I create a form or a process timeline or anything. Once I have permissions set at the folder level, every object I create in that folder inherits the permissions of the parent folder. Even more than that, once I have an object like a form that exists in a folder, and I create an instance of that form, that new form instance will also inherit the permissions that have been granted to the form definition. And in that form instance or process instance, if I were to upload a document attachment, that document attachment then becomes a child, ideally, of the process, because we recommend that you attach documents to the process. So let's say it's a process timeline instance. That new document attachment now becomes a child of the process timeline instance and will automatically inherit all of the permissions of the timeline instance. So this inheritance starts at the folder level, and every time I create a new object, whether I'm creating it in the UI by creating a new form or process definition, or whether it's an end user who is creating it simply by submitting a form to create the process and form instance once that form is submitted, then all of those permissions just get inherited down the chain all the way down to the end. Because of inheritance, we recommend that you set your permissions at the folder level. And once your permissions are set, then you can create the objects in the folder to inherit those desired permissions. And by inheriting those desired permissions, we can then see that every object that gets created has all of the correct permissions. So it makes permissions and permissions management easier for us over the long term, especially when we get, if you look at how many folders I have in here, if I had to set permissions on every object, on the hundreds and hundreds of objects that I have here, it would drive me insane. So it is best to have a set of standard permissions, especially on a production system, that every object in that system uses and replicates. There are there's not really any exceptions as far as end users go. There might be different permissions that you want to assign to different levels of, let's say, administrators or just implementers. Like, for example, I might want to give some implementers access to folder A and a different set of implementers access to folder B. And the people who work in folder A can't do anything in folder B, and vice versa in terms of creating or editing objects. So permissions also give me the ability in my production, although that would be a development environment. In a development environment, even to sort of lock down different areas of my development server to different groups of implementers, should I want to do that. I know most of you have a pretty standard set of implementers who pretty much do everything. But if you need to bifurcate them out in different work areas, you can certainly do that in your content list with permissions. And of course, anything that gets created in folder A will inherit those permissions and will then only be accessible by folder A people. There are a couple of different methods then of setting permissions. So let's talk about setting permissions in general, and then let's talk about some of the specifics in terms of how you might want to set up a production server. As I said, I think in the first sentence out of my mouth on this topic was we can set permissions for a user or a group of users or class of users to apply permissions to. Classes of user are a set of dynamic users whose members are going to change over time, and in fact may change rapidly over time. For example, I have process users as a class of users. So that means any user who is a participant in the process can be assigned specific permissions. Now, for different processes, the people who are included in process users for a specific instance of a process. So I have instance A and instance B. The users of instance A might be different than the users of instance B. All of those users are in a class called process users, but the class of process users for instance A will contain a different set of users, perhaps, than the class process users who can access instance B. So this can change over time for process users. So that is a specific class, which we generally don't have to worry too much about for reasons that I'll explain later. The other class, anonymous users. Anyone who does not authenticate in Process Director is considered an anonymous user. We don't know who they are. They don't have a user account. They don't log in. By default, anonymous users have no access to Process Director at all. You have to grant that access specifically. The most common use case for granting access to anonymous users is to enable them to run and view form instances. So generally, we only set anonymous users in most cases. There's two times when you would set anonymous users. There may be instances where you want anonymous users to be able to submit a form or participate in a process activity. So in that case, you would need to set anonymous permissions to either be able to submit the form. I think the most common thing is for form submissions. I have a form in Process Director. I want to link it via URL to a website that is accessible to my customers or the public or what have you. And from that website, I would provide them a link to a form which allows anonymous users to run that form, and they can then open the form up and submit it. Commonly, it's for customers. Customers are not really part of your Process Director system in most cases. But still, you might want them to be able to submit forms. One of our customers is a large pet health insurance company. And so when their insurance customers submit health insurance claims for their pets' veterinary bills, they're using Process Director with a form for anonymous users so that those users who are not part of Process Director, their customers, they can open that form, they can put in their policy information and whatever other stuff they need, and they submit it. Once they submit it, that kicks off the process of, claims adjustment and approval inside their company. And of course, that all goes to internal users. That's probably the most common use case. The second most common use case would be if you want to give anonymous users access to a knowledge view so that they can, see the process that see the status. That's the word I'm looking for. Status. Couldn't remember it. They want to see the status of all of the forms that they've submitted. And so the way that you would do that is you just provide them with a knowledge view that has view children permission for anonymous users so that they could view that knowledge view. Actually, I think you'd give them run permission for that knowledge view. We'll have to discuss what all of those individual permissions mean in a second. But those are the two use cases for anonymous users. So basically, people who don't log into Process Director, they don't have an account. Object creator. This is specifically the user that created the object. In the case of a form definition, it'll obviously be you or one of your fellow implementers. In the case of a form instance, it will be the user who submitted the form and created the form instance. They become the object creator. Technically, if there's a process associated with that form, which there most likely is, they would be the object creator of that process instance too. So object creator always points to the user who created the object. I say always, but there's a big but there. Sometimes you create objects automatically, programmatically. For example, you might create an object via a goal, and the goal invokes a process. The process starts to run, it attaches a form to the process, it assigns a task to a process timeline, or assigns a task to a user via a user activity in a process timeline. Then the object creator gets a little tenuous. I think in most cases, the object creator that gets passed in that case would be back to the user who created the goal definition. It'll kind of like fall through as the object creator. But in most cases, the object creator is either the user who created the definition object that resides in the content list, or the user who created the form or process instance that is running after they submit the form. So that's your object creator. Process users, we've already explained. And then we get down to actually assigning to users or groups. Like most assignments, whenever it comes down to specifying users, while you can assign a permission to a specific user, so, I can assign a permission to Diana, We generally don't recommend that. Generally, we recommend that you assign via group. Now, this is a group that exists in Process Director, so via a user group. So if I want to assign this to, do I have finance on the system? Yes, I do. So if I want to assign this to finance, that means that everyone in the finance group gets specific permissions that I can assign to this object and to all child objects that get created out of it. Once I have selected who I'm going to assign this to, you know what, we might as well just do it for a group since we're here anyway. So I probably shouldn't have erased that. So let's say the finance group. This is the recommended way that BP wants you to assign, or recommends that you assign permissions. It's the easiest way of doing it. Assigning permissions at the individual user level, especially on a large system, is really a nightmare to try to keep up with. So assigning via groups is generally best. Once I've selected who I want to set permissions for, I now have to set the permissions that I want to grant. So there are 7 different permissions that I can apply. Now, it's important to note that some of these permissions are low-level permissions, and some of them are higher-level permissions. So, for example, let's start with these first 3. View permissions. I can look at the thing. I can see it in the content list. I can open it. Okay, that's my basic level of access to a content list object. That is the view permission. If I want to be able to edit that object, well, I'm going to need modify permission, because it's one thing to look at it. It's another thing to be able to change it. So changing an object's definition is a higher level of permission than just viewing the object in the content list, just being able to look at it. But then I have delete permission. Not only can I look at it, not only can I make changes to it if I want, I can just delete it from the content list. Now, it's not possible to give me delete permission without also giving me view and modify permissions. So selecting a higher level of permission automatically includes any lower levels of permission. I can't delete an object I can't look at. I can't even delete an object I can't modify. But I can view, but if I select modify, it includes view. If I select delete, it includes view and modify. So the more permission you give someone, it automatically includes any lower level permissions, which are implicit. Obviously, if I give delete permission, I have to have view permission. You need to keep that in mind. Now, some permissions are kind of special, like the run permission. Now, this view, modify, and delete, and run, but run is special. We'll get to it in a second. View, modify, delete, and run are all permissions on content list objects, the definition objects, form definitions, process timeline definitions, knowledge view definitions. It only affects those definition objects. And run is a special permission on that definition object, because that is the permission that allows me to open an instance of the object and submit it. It allows me, in the case of a form, it allows me to run the form and submit the form. So if I give all authenticated users run permission on everything, that would allow them to actually run those objects, assuming they could get access to them. Let's say I gave them a list of forms that I allowed them to run, giving them run permission. And run permission is largely really only relevant to, well, it's actually relevant to process timelines, but you generally don't want people just to run process timelines willy-nilly. The most common use case for run is for forms and knowledge views. Because in both of those cases, I need to run the form to submit it. I need to run the knowledge view to have it return the records and display the records to me. So run allows me to actually activate or invoke the objects and make them start running. You want to be real careful with things like process timelines, because even though there is a valid run permission for process timelines, the reality is that you generally don't want end users just to be able to start a process de novo. Generally, what you want users to do is to be able to open a form and submit it and look at a knowledge view. The run permission, like all permissions, might not be applicable to specific objects. For example, let's say I upload an image. Right, giving run permission on an image doesn't actually do anything, because images don't, run. They're simply files. They either exist or they don't, but they don't run and they don't invoke anything. So not all permissions are meaningful for all objects. So the run permission would be meaningful for things like forms, process timelines, knowledge views, goals, technically stream actions. But a folder that had run permission, no, that folders don't do anything. They either exist or don't. So if a folder exists, giving a user run permission on a folder accomplishes nothing. There are no folder instances, for example, that get created. So some permissions simply don't apply to everything, and run is one of those. I then have view children. What that enables me to do is to view child objects of a parent. So generally, if you have a form and you want people to be able to look at form instances in a knowledge view, then that form needs to have view children permissions set. Because if you don't allow a user to view the child objects of a form, which are form instances, they simply won't appear in a knowledge view. And by the way, this is not an uncommon tech support question that comes in from new customers when they say, hey, I want my users to be able to, run this knowledge view and see these form instances, but none of them are showing up. The answer is almost always, well, you need to have view children permission on all of those form instances. Because if you don't, you can't even show them in a knowledge view, because view means exactly what it is. If I don't have view as, in this case, view children selected, I can't see it. I'm not allowed to look at it. So view children is kind of an important property to set up so that your users can view the instances that get created. Modify children, just like with the object definitions for view, modify, delete, it's really the same for the instance definitions under view, modify, and delete children. Every increased permission requires that I have the lower level permissions in order for the higher level permission to activate. And so if I want users to either view, modify, or delete instances from the content list, I can do that simply by giving them view, modify, and delete children. So let's say I wanted to set up a new system, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete. Let's keep it for now. So let's say I wanted to set up a system, and in this case, it'd be in a folder, and I want my finance people to do nothing. So the people in the finance group, I want them to be able to do nothing but be able to submit forms and to look at some knowledge views. The only permissions I need to give them are view children and run permissions. And if they have those two permissions and I click add new permission, then people in the finance group are now only allowed to view children. So to view the form instances so I can show them in knowledge views, and to run the form instances so that they could set their or submit their forms, those forms which presumably they're going to view in knowledge views. Or at least so you might think. Unfortunately, with the setup that I have here, that is not the permission that the finance group has. If you are in multiple groups in a set of permissions, you as a user will always be granted the highest level of permissions for any group for which you're a member. So, I was about to delete this, but I couldn't delete it because I needed to explain this very important thing. So I'm walking away now, fat, dumb, and happy, thinking all of my people in the finance group can only, if you're in the finance group, you can only run and view children. But that's not true. Because guess what group every member of the finance group is also a member of? All authenticated users. And in this particular case, if you're a member of the all authenticated users group, you have view, modify, delete, run, view, modify, and delete children permissions as well. So what that means is that everyone in the finance group has all the permissions they need to do anything they want in this folder. So with permissive access, which is to say, if I give you access, you have access. With permissive access, if I'm a member of both the finance and the all authenticated users group, which I most certainly am, then I have full access to everything on the system because I'm a member of both groups and I'm going to get the most expansive set of permissions for all of the groups for which I'm a member. So in this case, to just set these permissions for the finance group, I am in fact going to need to delete the all authenticated users group. So now I have a much more restrictive setup. So the only people now who have access to this folder is, of course, the finance group. And the only thing they can do are run the items that are in the folder, and they can view children, which I'm only giving them because I want them to be able to see knowledge views. If I didn't want them to see knowledge views, I wouldn't even need to give them view children. All I really need to give end users to use the system is run permissions. On a production system, however, you are generally going to want people to see knowledge views at some point. So your minimal permission set for end users on a system is to give them run and modify and view children permission. Now, I probably wouldn't do it in this way. What I would probably do is delete this. I would go back to all authenticated users. Now, remember, whenever you first get the system, your all authenticated users permissions look like this. So I have yes on all permissions. So what I would probably do if I was setting up a system just de novo is I would probably tritty trot right up here to my partition root, and I would go into the partition root. And as you can see, I have very loose systems or very loose permissions on the system. What I would probably do is go into the default partition, go into the, or whatever it's called on your system. In my case, it's default partition, go into that folder's properties, and then I would edit the permissions. And what I would do is I would just turn off view, modify, delete, modify children, and delete children. And that would be the permissions that I would set on that system. So on a production system, your minimal permission set or your minimal standard permission set should be this for all authenticated users. All authenticated users is a good place to do this because I'm giving minimal permissions at my widest possible user group. All authenticated users is everybody. So I'm giving everybody very limited permissions. Now, obviously, I have implementers and other people who are going to need to access the system. So I'm going to need additional permissions. So all authenticated users is only my base. I'm going to probably have to add an implementers group and then give them, view and or at least view and modify permission, maybe delete permission as well. Obviously, if you're a system administrator, you can do anything you want. So none of the permissions affect you. If you set a user as a partition administrator, none of the permissions you set here affect them. They have full control over all the objects in the content list as well, so they can do whatever they want. But for everybody else who is not either a partition administrator or a system administrator, you're going to need to create the appropriate groups like implementers and process managers and whatever it is. And for each of those groups, you can give them slightly more expansive permissions to, view, modify, and delete in the content list. So for like process managers, so I might have a group called process managers. These are the people who oversee the processes that are running from day to day. So what I might give them is view and modify permission, but not delete permission. I might not give anybody delete permission unless you're either a system administrator or a partition administrator. Or maybe an implementer, I'd give delete permissions because, at least on some folders, because it would be hard for them in their folders to do the work. So I might have several different permissions group, but the important thing to remember is that the more expansive groups, which is to say the groups that contain the most people, the most generalized groups, and the most generalized group possible is all authenticated users in terms of actual process director users. They should have the least permissions. And your minimal permission set is probably run and view children for all authenticated users. And then for your smaller groups, then you can give them more expansive permissions that match the particular duties that they have. And now we have to talk about replication, because when I first opened my system, and like for this system right now, my actual setup here, this is the default setup, so everybody can do everything. But if I go in and I make some changes to all authenticated users and I restrict them to run and view children, and then I create some additional permissions. So I have a permission set for implementers and a permission set for process managers. So I now have 3 different permission sets. Well, I'm going to want to have everything in my system inherit those permissions. And I want those to be the default permissions every time I create a new object in my system. So I've got to get those permissions, because usually whenever you first install Process Director, there is a folder or two inside the default partition. Not always, but there usually is. And certainly if we install Process Director for you at on a cloud server, it's probably going to already have the custom tasks in it. It's probably already going to have the template library in it and the template data folder, which is only needed if you have our template library. If you have your own template library, you don't need that folder. And there's maybe a couple of, like the little utility functions that run in a folder. And we also have a knowledge views folder that run. I can actually, well, that's not what I wanted. I can actually show them here. So generally custom tasks, custom utilities, knowledge views, maybe samples will be in there as well. And they'll all have, all of these same properties here, these permissions that are set up here at the default permission. So what I'm probably going to have to do now that I have changed the permissions at my very root folder, what I'm going to have to do is replicate them. Now, we're not going to do that here from this folder. But we will go down here to permissions and we'll replicate them. So in this folder, I have my full permission set. And then down here below it in the webinar folder, I have the same permissions because it inherited those all authenticated user permissions. So if at the higher level, like we were just talking about, if I go into the default partition and start changing those partitions around, so we'll go into our permissions folder. You know what? I don't want to go into my permissions folder. Let me go here and create a new folder because I don't want to mess up the things that are in the item actions folder, which we'll get to in a little bit. So let me go into this folder here and I'll create a new folder and we'll just call this perms test. And we'll hit OK. There we go. We're happy. We look at the permissions. Again, we have inherited the all authenticated user permissions. So let's go back up here to my webinar folder and let's change the permissions a little bit. So we will go to the properties tab there. And let's just go into, we won't make this too onerous. Let's just go into specific group and let's go to finance and choose that. And we will give finance, let's give them modify, run, and view and modify children permissions. So they can go in later on and make changes to form instances. I'm not sure why I would do that. I'm just giving them the permissions. So we're going to go ahead and, oh, I have to add new permission. So let's click add new permission. So now I have these two groups. Well, now this is fine. And I can save this. But of course, if I go down here into my perms test folder, well, it still says all authenticated users. So when I change the parent object, so in this case, the parent folder, and I have special permissions, I need to be able to take these permissions that I've changed and reflect them in all of the lower folders. I mean, if I create a new object, I'm fine, right? If I go into here and create a new folder and call it inherited, and I hit OK, and I go to its folder properties. Okay, well, great. It has inherited the permissions that I wanted it to inherit. So I've got these two permission sets. So every time I create a new object, I'm a happy camper. I'm getting the proper permissions, and I never have to think about them again in most cases. But perms test exists. And perms test now has the wrong permissions. So I need to be able to get those permissions down to perms test. So the way that I would do that is go here into the parent folder, and I would replicate those permissions. I have two methods of doing that. I can replicate the current permissions to only the content list objects, form definitions, timeline definitions, etc. Or I can replicate the current permissions to all child objects and instances. So not only will this change all of the child objects for this folder, and by the way, this will do it all the way down the chain. If I have 5 subfolders, it's going to recurse through all 5 subfolders and change everything. What you want to change and which of these two options you want to choose, we'd have to look at specific case-by-case basis. The important thing to remember now from a training aspect is I can either replicate my permissions to just the objects, or I can replicate them not only to the objects, but also to all of the object instances that exist inside all of my objects. So so the obvious example is forms. Clicking replicate to all child objects will change permissions on the form definition. Changing all child objects and instances will change the permission both on the form definition and on all of the form instances that exist. So if I have 1,000 form instances, it's going to change those permissions on all 1,000 form instances. So As to which one you want to click at any particular point in time, I can't tell you. Although I think in most cases, you're probably going to want to do it to all child objects and instances, because in most cases, you're probably making sort of a fundamental change to who can see things. And in most cases, you're going to want to replicate that to the instances as well. But the safe choice is always replicate current permissions to all child objects. But if you have 1,000 form instances and you want to give all 1,000 of them different permissions, you're just going to have to, go into each one of those instances and change them all manually. So that's how I can get my permissions. So in this case, I have no instances. So it literally doesn't matter which of these two buttons I click, but I'm going to click replicate current permissions to all child objects. And okay, permissions have been replicated to all children. Well, is that true? Let's look at our inherited folder and check its permissions. And oh yes, it is true. I now have this second group of permissions that have been applied here at this folder level, which originally was just all authenticated users. So it now inherited my new permissions. And of course, if I go, no, inherited was fine when I created it because I created it after I changed permissions. It's perms test we want to look at, and perms test is also fine as well. It has the proper permissions. So that's the basics on just setting those permissions. But let's look at something here a little more closely. So in this permissions folder, now let's look at the permissions that I have on this folder. All authenticated users can do everything. That's fine, but is that true for everything in this folder? Do I need to replicate the permissions down? Now, believe me, in this case, I'm not gonna. But I might want to check show permissions exceptions to see if there are any objects, any child objects of this folder that have different permissions than the folder. In this case, there are. Indeed, every child object of this folder has different permissions because I've just gone in and set them differently, or they were different before. So everything in item actions is got different permissions. My webinar folder has different permissions. My inherited folder and my perms test all have different permissions. So every object has different permissions than the permissions of this parent folder. So what this permissions exception section enables you to do is to look down at all of these folders and see what permissions exceptions exist in those folders. Now that I know they're different, I can make the decision whether I want to replicate the permissions in this folder, which I do not, or whether I want to replicate to child objects and instances. Either way, I don't want to do it because I have special permissions set up for all of these, and that is fine. It may in fact be that you have, some of the subfolders have different permissions set. And if so, then when you create objects in those subfolders, they will create the permissions of their parent folder. And obviously instances creating the permissions of their parent. So that's how I can set permissions. And that's a little bit about permissions methodology. However, there's one more thing that we need to talk about, which is what happens if I need to go in and monkey around with permissions at an even lower level, which you might need to do. So I have this little application set up right here. Now, the main way of setting permissions are the ways that we've talked about. We're going to go in at the folder level. We're going to set permissions. We're going to replicate those permissions to all of the child folders. And when I say at the folder level, it could be all the way up here at the default partition level to set our more restrictive permissions on a production system. But I'm going to go into a parent object somewhere, and I am going to, in that parent object, set permissions. And if any child objects exist, I'm probably going to replicate those permissions to the existing child objects. Otherwise, as I create objects, they'll just inherit the correct permissions automatically. That's generally how I set permissions in the system. However, on a case-by-case basis, I may have to do something a little different. For example, let's say that I have a form, and this form, which in this case just happens to take document attachments. Now, I don't want anonymous users to touch my form. I don't want them to run it. I don't want them to view it. They're not going to participate in the process. I don't want them to have any access at all to my form. But once I upload documents, I might want to give anonymous users access to a knowledge view that displays the list of documents, and I might want them to be able to see the documents. For example, I might have a series of policy documents or marketing documents or whatever that I want anonymous users to see, and I want to be able to give anonymous users access to it from outside my system. So I don't want them to play around in anything that has to do with the process of uploading and approving those documents. But at some point, I do want anonymous users to be able to access those documents. So what that means is that whenever I create this application, we'll go into the properties folder. It's going to have a set of properties. Now, don't worry about these properties. I've again set it up so that I have restrictive properties for all authenticated users, and then I have an admin group with slightly more expansive properties. They don't really mean anything. It's just a sample to show property differences. But in this case, my authenticated users can access any of these objects, and they can run the form and submit it, and they can view the form instance. My admins can go in and modify and delete objects in here, which you would expect from people in the admin group. Okay, great. So those are my property settings. And if I go into each of my objects, so let's just go into the form itself, every object has its own permissions tab. So I have my Forms Permissions tab here. So on this, I have a little different thing. I have Run and View Children Permission. I don't know why I have Modify Children Permission, which is I need to change. I would probably take this off. I don't need Modify Children Permission because I don't want them to modify it outside of a process, but that's fine. These are now my form permissions. In fact, I think I can just go ahead and delete these permissions entirely. So let's say I don't want anonymous users to do anything with this particular form. So let's go ahead and update that object. I probably shouldn't have changed it. I'm just doing things on the fly, but hopefully it'll still work with the way that I've got it set up. So great. I've got these different permissions on these different things, and everybody but my anonymous users can access stuff. But let's go into my process timeline. Now, this is the only activity in the process timeline. This would obviously be something that we did at the very end of an approval process or what have you, but I need to be sure that my anonymous users can view those documents. So what I'm going to do in this particular case is I am going to run the item actions custom task. And what I'm going to do, and there's a lot of things that you can do with item actions. You can move items, and you can rename them, and you can copy them, and you can also set their permissions. So here's what I want to do. I want to run the items actions custom task. I want to run timeline references. and I only want to apply this to documents. And in fact, I don't even want to do all the documents. I only want to do documents that are in a specific group, a group named PDF. I don't want to do any move or copy actions, but I do want to set permissions. I certainly don't want to delete, which is something you can also do with the item action. But I do want to set permissions. I can set these permissions in a couple of ways. I can copy the permission from the object's parent. I don't really need to do that because this is a form attachment. It's automatically going to inherit their permissions. I can copy permissions from the folder level. Again, in this case, unnecessary. Everything is already inherited those permissions from the folder level. But I can set permissions manually, which is what I want to do, because what I want to do is give anonymous users view permission to any document that is in the PDF group. So I'm being very specific about changing some very specific permissions on a very specific child object or set of objects, very limited. I'm still not, as an anonymous user, going to be able to see the form or anything else in the content list, but I do want my anonymous users to be able to view the document attachments. So I'm going to hit OK and close. Well, I didn't change any configuration, so I don't really have to worry about changing anything. All I really need to worry about is just running the form. So I have a permissions form. It doesn't do much but accept a document. I'm just going to upload a document, and I'm just going to pull it out of my docs folder, my journal editor letter, and I'm going to upload it. Fine. And now I am going to submit my form, and it's going to kick off my process. My process is already done. So let's go back and look at let's go through this step by step. So let's look at my permissions timeline, because I attached the form to the process timeline, which is what we generally recommend. So let's just open up the permissions timeline, and let's go to its permissions. Okay, all authenticated users run view children, modify children. Admin group, well, they can do everything. Okay, great. Those are my permissions. Now let's look at well, I don't have any active timelines. Let's look at my completed timelines. This is the one that I just submitted right here. So let's go in and look at its properties. So let's go in and look at the permissions for this particular object. Okay, great. I've got all authenticated users. Now, this is a child object. So at this point, we now have to talk about the permissions differences on instances versus objects. Objects have 7 properties. Instances have 4. When I select on an object, view children, modify children, delete children, and run, those 4 permissions become the view, modify, delete, and run permissions for the child objects that are created. So in this case, the form instance has view children and modify children permission for all authenticated users. And when this timeline instance was created, the view children and modify children permissions are transferred on the child object as view and modify. I did not have delete children checked on the process timeline definition. And so therefore, on the instance, delete permission has not been granted to the instance. And then, of course, run permission, well, run applies to both objects and instances. It's the same permission, whether it's an object or an instance. So it is important to remember that those view, modify, and delete children properties there's no child to a form instance. Well, I guess a document would be technically a child object to the form instance. Um, but no, not really. It's actually a sibling object of the form instance. We call them document attachments and process attachments. And we kind of show them to you in a hierarchical way in Process Director. For example, if we look at the timeline instance, it says timeline items. And if we open it up, it shows me the form and it shows me the journal editor letter that I just uploaded. And that kind of gives us the idea that, okay, well, I have my permissions timeline. That's the parent object. And then I have, this timeline instance, which is the child object. And then I have the form and the document, which are both attached to the timeline instance. So they must be children of the timeline instance. Not really. It kind of looks that way, but they're actually sibling objects of the child instance. So they're not really children of the instance. They're brothers and sisters of the instance. And so they will inherit the view children, modify children, delete children, and run properties of the parent object. While we're here and we're looking at the journal editor letter, since we have it, let's go ahead and look at its properties as well. Now, it also has its own permissions properties, but it has a property that none of the other objects have. It has an anonymous users property, and the anonymous users have view property for this particular object. Now, remember, we had to set this separately, and the way that we set this separately is via the item actions custom task. The purpose of the item actions custom task, while largely to move and delete and change things in the content list, permissions are an important component of that, because there are use cases like the one that we've been looking at here, where I need to take an object in the content list, which in this case is a document attachment. I need to, and by the way, the document attachment is not really even a content list object in and of itself. It is a attachment that is stored in the database, but it's not really accessible through the content list directly. I really have to open up the timeline instance to be able to access this document, or I need to be able to grab it via a knowledge view, which will also grab, all of the documents in the system as well. And that needs to have, that document just needs to have different permissions. I need to allow anonymous users to look at it. Even if I don't want them to look at my form or anything else, I still want to be able to present that to them. Normally, if I have a child object like this and I want to set its permission, normally what we do is change the permissions of the parent and we replicate it down. But this is one of those cases where we wouldn't want to do that, and where replication doesn't work for us. And because it doesn't work for us, I need to have an alternative method for setting permissions on specific objects, or in this case, I only uploaded one object, but I could have uploaded 12. And so I would have had 12 forms in this, or 12 documents in this PDF group that need a different permission from the parent process timeline. So that's where the item actions custom task comes in, because the item actions custom task is my kind of alternative way of being able to change permissions on a specific set of objects without using replication from a parent, because I need to have a unique set of permissions set on those objects. So we can certainly do that by creating the appropriate configuration for an items action object and setting it up. A couple of little, I don't know what to call them, um, quirks or what have you, note that down here in my permissions timeline, my permissions timeline, if I go to the permissions tab, what's missing from the bottom? My permissions exceptions. I don't have a permissions exception report at the individual object level. I have a permissions tab, and I can go in and add unique permissions on every object in the system because everything has a permissions tab. But one big difference here is I do not have that permissions exception tab. That permissions exception tab lives at the folder level. And remember, at the folder level, we have it set up, and of course, the permissions on the form and process timeline are all different, I think, because I configured them all individually. So they're rather different because I do have some that have anonymous users. There's some differences there's at least one difference in the permissions at each level. I think I did at one point on the form even have unauthenticated users. But in any event, this permissions exception, that exists at the folder level. Again, our recommendation is that permissions get set at the folder level, that you set them every time you create a folder, unless, of course, you have them already set at the default partition, in which case they should just inherit the default permissions that you have set. If you're going to change permissions, remember, the only way to get those new permissions to child objects is to replicate them. If you're unsure whether child objects have different permissions, you can always go to the folder and you can always generate the permissions exception report and see which of the objects at the lower level of the folder or in the folder contents have different permissions, which will help you determine whether or not you do in fact need to replicate, or whether I just need to, in this case, I think I can replicate it and it would be just fine. But here's where I have to be careful now. Now I've got all of these objects, right? And all of these objects, especially these documents, now have different permissions. Now, one thing I'm not seeing here is this, but just remember, I'm going to replicate my current permissions to all child objects and instances. So what I would expect to happen is for everything to match. My permissions exception, well, did I hit all child objects? I think I hit all child objects and instances. So my permissions have now been replicated. I don't know whether I'm seeing permissions exceptions because I have to go out and come back in and it's showing me the old report or not. But I think all of my permissions are the same. It's still showing me the report. Not sure what's going on there. And we're not going to go in and take a look at each one of these things individually. Although I am going to go to completed timelines. I am going to go back to this to look at the journal editor letter. And we are going to go to its properties. And now we have a problem. So I don't know what's going on with the show exceptions report, but I do know what's going on here. And this is why I intentionally set, all child objects and instances. Because I wanted to illustrate a problem that you can create for yourself, and which I have in fact created for myself here by replicating my permissions to all child objects and instances. What I really should have done is replicated my permissions to the child objects. In many cases, replicating them to the child instances probably wouldn't have hurt anything, but I have a special circumstance here. I have a special set of permissions that I only want applied to the document. But because I said replicate to all child objects and instances, Process Director assumed that that is what I wanted it to do, and so it did. So my permissions on this document for my anonymous users have now been removed, because now I am showing the permissions that I needed to show for my my parent object. And the special permissions have now been removed because I went ahead and replicated them. So the only way back from this now, of course, is be to go to each one of these individual process timeline things. And I guess I'd have to, restart the timeline at this activity, which is going to get super tedious, super quick if I have 1,000 of these things. And I can restart the timeline, and there we go. It's done. And I suppose I can go check my child objects and look at my journal editor letter. And I didn't want to set its group name. I wanted to go to its properties. And now look, happily, my all authenticated users is back for this specific instance, but I would now have to rebuild all of these timelines. I have to rerun them all. Now, for me, there's what, 8 of them? Yeah, no big deal. If there's 100 of these or 1,000 of these, it becomes a real problem. So some caution is warranted. Whenever you go into the folder level and you're making that decision, do I do just child objects only or child objects and instances? While in most cases, child objects and instances won't get you in a lot of trouble, the potential is there. Again, I can't answer a general question about when I would click one button over the other. All I can tell you is what is going to happen if you click one button over the other. And you really do need to think through the implications. As I said when we were first talking about these buttons, this is the safe choice because all I have to worry about is replicating to all of my child objects. So it's going to change my form and my knowledge view, my process timeline, and even the sample form PDF, which I'm not entirely sure why is here, but there we go. But when I clicked replicate current permissions to all child objects only, what it didn't do, oh, it's a timeline instance. It'll open the properties for me automatically. But what, oh, that's the timeline. Duh, I need to look at the document. Finally, the right object. What it didn't do is remove my all authenticated users. So the general rule of thumb, especially when I'm working at the folder level with permissions, the general rule of thumb is replicate current permissions to all child objects only. That's the safe button to click. Whether you want to click this button, that is going to require some thinky pain because you have to figure out exactly what is going to happen if I go in and start messing around with my object instances. Are things going to work the way that I expect them to work for object instances? There's something else that we need to explain here that is very important. And that is whenever we set our permission. So whenever we went here to webinar, right? And we set these more restrictive permissions and we went ahead and replicated them. And I thought we set restrictive permissions here. Apparently we didn't. So what we would want to do here, maybe I just didn't save it after we did it. So for all authenticated users, obviously we want to turn all of this stuff back off. And we want to hit update and we want to update our folder and we'll now replicate those permissions to all of the folder objects. Okay, so great. I've got all of these objects and they all now inherit my permissions. Now note, for all authenticated users, I only have run and view children permission. I do not have modify children permission on my objects. So that means that if I create a form anywhere in any of these folders, we'll just do it here. So we'll create a new form definition. And we'll just call it perms form, and it doesn't really matter because we're not going to do anything with it. We don't really care about the form itself. What we really care about is its permissions, because I created it, and it's got view children, modify children, and delete children, with view children is yes and modify and delete is no. So that means when my form instance is created, I'm going to be able to view it, but technically I'm not going to be able to modify it. Okay, so what happens if that form task gets assigned to me and I have to make changes to it? Well, that's where process users comes in. You can assign at the folder level, you can assign special permissions to process users. You can't on the form, because on the form, we are going to break the permission structure for running form instances and process instances. So you are a member of process users if you're assigned a task in the process. There are not even any process users, because it's a form, not a process anyway. There's not even a process user's permission on a form. So if I get assigned a task and I have modify children equals no, which means I can't make changes to it and I can't save it, then how can I complete my task? Whenever a form and process timeline are running and you're assigned a task and you become a task participant and you get to see the form as a task participant, special magic is just going to automatically happen. Whatever the standard permissions that you have set down here at the folder, or in this case, in the form or the process timeline, they don't matter. You've been assigned a task. So you are automatically going to get, well, it won't be modify children because it'll be a form instance. So on the form instance, you are automatically going to get modify permission on that form instance, even though modify children is no. And if you were to open the form instance outside of task context, right? Just to open it from just a normal knowledge view, just to look at the form, you wouldn't be able to make any changes to it, because your standard permission for modify children will, when it gets transferred down to the form instance, become the modify permission for that form instance, and it'll be no. So if you open it up from a content list, you're not going to be able to make any changes. However, if you are a process participant, you're a process user, and you are running in a current user task, Process Director is going to give you all of the permissions you need to complete that task. So you will be able to edit that form. You will be able to submit it. You'll be able to probably remove information from the form. You won't be able to delete the instance, but you will be able to make any changes that you need to on that form. You will automatically receive modify permission on that form as a task participant so that you can complete the task. You'll receive any permission that you need to complete whatever task is assigned to you, irrespective of any of the permissions that have been explicitly granted in any of the objects in Process Director. So it works much like the partition administrator permission works whenever you're filling out a user account. I have all of these permissions that apply to everybody except very special people. If I am, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, let's just open up Barb Stanley here. If I have, where is it? Oh, she's already a configuration. Wait, she's already, where is it? There it is, partition admin. This has changed so much over the last 6 months. It's hard for me to find stuff. So this right here, this has nothing to do, obviously, with permissions, this checkbox that says System Partition Admin. But if I check System Partition Admin for Barb, all of a sudden Barb now gets to go anywhere she wants in the content list and gets to do anything that she wants to do anywhere. And if I go back over here and look at permissions, there's nothing in here that says anything about partition admins. I don't have partition admins as a dropdown. By the way, there's nothing in here about system admins either. Those don't appear on the dropdown either. So just like partition admins or system admins, process participants, whenever they are actively running in a task, get their own specialized set of permissions that apply temporarily for that particular process instance until they complete their task. It doesn't give them access to other process instances. If they are not running in a task actively, it reverts back to the normal permissions that they have. But you should just know that that is a special class of users, process participants, who get whatever permissions they need to do the stuff they need to do to complete their task. Once they complete their task, those permissions go poof, they disappear, and they are back just to the normal drudgery of a regular user on a system who's not allowed to do anything fun. That's the way the system works for permissions. So it's almost 11:30. Let's sum up real quick. Set permissions early, like as soon as you open your system. This is bad advice to everyone who is listening to my voice right now live, because I know you've all had systems for a couple of years now, so it's too late for that. But in the future, if you get new systems, set permissions early. Set permissions at the folder level. When setting permissions, the biggest groups should have the smallest permissions. So all authenticated users should really be able to do nothing more than run and view children. That should be it. That's the whole scope. As you narrow the users down to smaller and smaller groups, the general rule is you can give them, those smaller groups, more expansive permissions. Just remember, if I'm a member of more than one group, I am going to get the most expansive permissions of whatever the most liberal permissions are for whatever groups I'm in. Be careful with replication, because as we just saw, we can mess some things up. So you have to be careful with how you're going to replicate. So keep that in mind. Don't give any more permissions to any particular group than is necessary. And the corollary to that, which I missed, is always assign permissions if you can at the group level, because that makes permissions management easier. If I set permissions at the user level, then every time I change users or a user does something different, goes to a new job, I got to go and try to find out where that user has permissions. If I set permissions by groups, then if the user moves to a new job, I just take him out of one group and put him in the group for his new job as he's moved around in the organization, and everything just works because I'll check the group membership anytime I need to run permissions, like when an object is opened or selected to be viewed by a viewer. I check permissions right then and there, and if they're in the right group, then they get to see it. So managing by groups is just going to make your life a lot easier. And remember the item actions custom task, because sometimes setting permissions at the folder level, replicating them down, depending on inheritance to create new objects, that doesn't cover every use case. Item actions custom task enables you to really get specific and do specific permissions changes on specific objects. Just remember, when you do that, that makes replicating to all objects and instances a much more dangerous button to click. So you're going to have to think much longer and harder about, if I'm going to set permissions at the parent, like if I come back after having running permissions for 6 months and I go back to the default partition and say, you know what, I need to change my partition partition permissions, and I need to make them even more restrictive, and then I need to replicate them down. Okay, that's clicking on replicate to objects and instances is probably going to be a real problematic button to click. So just keep that in mind. The safe choice is always replicate permissions to all child objects. I say it's the safe choice, and I get the feeling that someone is going to do this and it's going to go horribly wrong, and you're going to blame me for saying it was perfectly safe to do. I'm not saying that replication is always perfectly safe. I don't know your permission system. What I can tell you is that this is definitely not a safe choice in many cases. So if you're going to do replication, the choice to even do replication, especially if you have a mature system and you're going to be changing something that's going to affect all of this stuff down here, you're probably going to want to think really long and hard about how that is going to work. And in fact, on a mature system, at a high, you may be limited to replicating at a fairly low level of folders in the folder structure, because you just have too much legacy stuff with different permissions that you can't really enforce those permissions across the entire system now, because there are just too many exceptions and too many special permissions that have probably been placed down at lower levels. So the final thing that you can do is you can go into installation settings, and there's a couple of things that you can do there. Is it in configuration? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it is in configuration. Object perms is your friend. Once you have a mature system, and in this case, I have many folders, and each of those folders have subfolders, or at least objects. How do I manage this system? Well, I've got the object permissions report, because the object permissions report is, okay, well, I apparently have a IMS test. Let's go with default partition. I have many partitions on this system, actually. So let me do a search. I probably shouldn't have done the entire partition because this is going to take a while, but it's going to show me all of my object permissions that are set on this system. So every folder, every form, every timeline definition, they're all going to be on here. As you can see, this is very long. Because it is very long, it is going to be worse than being stabbed trying to look at this through a web interface like this. So what I'm probably going to want to do is click the export to CSV so that I can save a CSV file and I can open it in CSV, which will open it in Excel. I would then at this point save this as an Excel file. And once it is saved as an Excel file, I can then use it to do all kinds of data mining that I might want to do on this file to see what all the permissions are and to see where I might have to change things. So object permissions is definitely your friend. Don't save. Just go away. Object permissions is definitely your friend. Similarly, in troubleshooting, is it in troubleshooting? There's another one. I can't remember where it is. I can't believe I've forgotten it off the top of my head. Let's go to user admin. There we go. User perms. There's also a user perms. Now, this will tell you who your system admins are and who your partition admins are. And this gives me not a level of at the object, but it does tell me who I have in my system that might have extraordinary permissions, system administrators, partition admins, so that I can ensure that I go through my system and fix any users that have these extended permissions because of the settings that I've given them on their user profile page. This is not as important as the object permissions. Object permissions are super important and super useful to get you a very granular view of what all your permissions are on the system. And once you have a mature system, trying to go through folder by folder and figure out what's what is probably going to be difficult and tedious, and you're probably not going to want to do that. So object permissions, especially on a mature system, is your friend. And friends, it is time for us to say goodbye. Have a great 3-day weekend. Tuesday is the feature spotlight webinar. So there's some new stuff in the product that I'm eager to talk about, and some bug fixes that we've come along with. So you won't want to miss that on Tuesday morning at 10. And for the remainder of you, we'll take a look at something different in the product next Thursday on our next session for the training webinar. Have a great week. Have a great 3-day weekend. We'll see you next week. So long.